There have been many notable debates among classical guitarists. We seem to be a particularly quarrelsome group. There were debates in the early 19th century over whether or not to use the left-hand thumb, or whether or not the guitar should have more than 6 strings. But of all the debates, the one that seems to be both the longest lasting and the most controversial is whether or not to use nails on the right hand. Today it's commonly thought that to play the modern classical guitar and its repertoire, you must have nails. However, many may be surprised to know that a number of fine concert guitarists played without nails well into the latter half of the 20th century, such as Manuel Cubedo and Juan Mercadal. They played concert halls, concerti, produced a number of recordings on modern instruments playing modern repertoire. Their recordings are readily available on YouTube. I'll include some links in the description below. Inspired in part by their example, I've been exploring no-nail playing for over half a year now, and while this certainly doesn't make me an expert on the subject, I have devoted a lot of time to it, and given the relative paucity of material on YouTube and elsewhere addressing the subject, I think I have something valuable to add. In particular, I've not seen a video on the history of no-nails technique, though there are web pages that discuss the history, and which I also link to below. The guitar and its technique get caught up in general historical trends. This is partly why the guitar's popularity comes in waves, and with it the way it is played. There are many reasons why there was a resurgence of the guitar in the early 20th century, but one reason, I would suggest, was because there was a general resurgence of interest in chamber music, as well as an interest in exotic and uncommon sounds. But the character of the instrument also changed because of the changing musical environment. The desire to play in large halls and in concerti, like other, more respected instruments, changed the technique, the repertoire, and the instrument itself in the Segovia era and beyond. The guitar became almost totally a solo instrument, and so, for instance, chamber music with guitar, not uncommon in the early 19th century, became quite a bit rarer in the 20th. With regards to the use of nails, the common belief that nails make the instrument louder and more brilliant, as well as the tendency towards greater colour in music in the 20th century, and especially with the increasing use of extended techniques in modern music, were some of the reasons why nail playing became preferable. While I'm not sure it is true that nails are necessarily louder, and if they are, the difference in volume is slight to my ear, perhaps comparable to the difference between a cellist using gut or metal strings. I do think it is true that nails can produce a greater variety of sound. Yes, without nails there is still much variety of timbre which is possible. Read Fernando Sor's method for many examples of how to imitate orchestral instruments on the guitar without nails. And techniques like raschiado are still possible, like so. Pizzicato, I think, is made even easier. But the bream-like extremes of texture, especially his glassy ponticello, are not as feasible. It is easier to produce harsher sounds with nails, which is a benefit in some modern music. So, for example, if I take the bream ponticello, I have a bit of nail on my fingers which I can still use. Very glassy sound. If I do it without nail, you see it's still nasal. It still sounds like a ponticello, but it's much warmer. The difference between tasto and ponticello without nails is evident, but it's nowhere near as extreme as with nails. Though, as you can see, even without nails, it's still possible to use some nail, and Fernando Sor described this in his method, where he would curl his right hand like so that the little bit of nail he had would come into contact with the string, and he could play chords that way, or double stops, or even single notes. The other historical change in favour of nails has to do with the growth in nail care. Glass files, like so, and fine-grade sandpaper, which I still use, acrylics, false nails, and so on, have arguably made nail playing more beautiful, and certainly more accessible to people whose nails grow in a less than perfect way. One of the earliest and most famous references to playing guitar with nails, and indeed the perils of playing guitar with nails, can be found in the 17th century. Francesco Corbetta was an Italian Baroque guitarist, one of the greatest players in the history of our instrument. Notably, he was employed for about 2 decades by Charles II. Corbetta and the guitar flourished in the Restoration court, with the king favouring the instrument. The guitar had not been so popular in England since the brief enthusiasm for the Renaissance guitar in the mid-16th century. The guitar even found an enthusiastic, though initially reluctant, convert in Samuel Pepys. Before his full and profound conversion to the instrument, Pepys heard Corbetta play and remarked in his diary, "Signor Francesco played most admirably, so well as I was mightily troubled that all pains should have been taken upon so bad an instrument," a verdict about guitarists that, I dare say, has been repeated to this day. Anyway, we know that Corbetta played with nails because we have references of him travelling to Turin with his consort and having to cancel the performance because of a broken nail, which must have been devastating, though graciously the Princess of Savoy still paid him. Guitarists at the time seem to have been more likely to play with nails than lutenists. I would imagine this is in part because the lute was, very generally speaking, used for more serious and profound music than the often vigorous and frothy output of the Baroque guitar. The ideal of the lute, that great, once sovereign instrument, evoked classical mythology and heavenly imagery in contrast to the more gregarious character of the guitar. And so the intimate, more rounded sound of fingertips arguably suits it better. Eventually the guitar became more like the lute, and so the way of playing it changed. The Baroque guitar had 5 strings and used a re-entrant tuning, whereby the strings are not ordered from low to high, like a modern classical guitar. This tuning makes possible many attractive effects, but limits musical sophistication. As with the lute, the use of the Baroque guitar declined sharply in the mid-18th century, but by the end of that century the guitar had metamorphosed into a 6-string instrument, and with the new tuning which we still use today. This made it capable of the sort of musical complexity of which the almost extinct lute had once been. Guitarists moved from reading tablature to staff notation, and a new and flourishing generation of guitar virtuosi and composers emerged. Moreover, it became an instrument often referenced in literature, and with many amateur enthusiasts. After some time in the wilderness, then, it had found a new place in a new culture. The new instrument and repertoire had different aesthetic priorities. Many therefore played without nails. The greatest exponent of this, and in my opinion the greatest guitarist composer of the period, was Fernando Sor. In his method, he wrote that, "Never in my life have I heard a guitarist whose playing was supportable if he played with the nails. The nails can produce but few gradations in the quality of sound. The piano passages can never be singing, nor the fortes sufficiently full. Their performance is, to me, what the harpsichord was in comparison to the pianoforte. The piano passages were always jingling, and in the fortes, the noise of the keys predominated over the sound of the wires." This passage will likely surprise people. It certainly surprised me. The idea that nails produce few gradations of sound is simply not true now, and I can only imagine that it has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with a profound difference in the quality of nail care. It is worth noting, however, that Sor nevertheless went on to praise his friend Aguado, who played with nails, writing that, "If the nails did not allow him to give the same expression as I did, he gave one peculiar to himself, which injured nothing." Yet despite all this, by the end of the 19th century, nail playing had become the dominant method. I'm not yet sure why, and I would be interested to hear any views on the matter. The guitar also, at this time, saw yet another of its many historical declines. It is, I would say, the musical instrument with the most extreme rises and falls in fashion. Most other instruments, once established, see continuous popular use, whereas the guitar is subject to historical vicissitudes. The late 19th century was one such example, characterized by ever bigger orchestras and grander operas, for instance. It was not a favourable time for an intimate instrument like the guitar. The man most responsible for again reviving interest in the guitar was Francesco Tarrega, who is, in my opinion, the almost saintly personification of the modern classical guitar. He represents for me the ideal guitar virtuoso, not the wild extravagance of Paganini, compelling though that must have been, but a retiring, intimate virtuosity, obsessed chiefly with making beautiful sounds, not bombarding people, not wowing people, though he was certainly capable of great technical virtuosity, but rather drawing his audience into a sublime musical world. It is from Tarrega that much of our modern repertoire began, and much of our technique. Most of the guitarists at the beginning of the 20th century were directly influenced by Tarrega. Even Segovia, who never met Tarrega, found that the great man occupied a mythical and idyllic place in his musical imagination, the example of how the guitar could be a serious and profound instrument. Tarrega for many decades played with nails, which he did simply because that was what he had always seen done. Then at the turn of the 20th century, he decided to cut off his nails. Tarrega was not trying to recreate an old technique. He was trying to discover a new, better sound. His flesh technique did not resemble earlier guitarists like Fernando Sor. He used a very different, more perpendicular hand position. So whereas Sor's hand position was something like this, Tarrega's was more like this. Tarrega made frequent use of the A finger, this one, whereas Sor used mainly P, I, and N. And Tarrega made very frequent use of appiando, or rest stroke, wherein the right hand finger, when it plucks, comes to rest on an adjacent string, like so. There is some debate regarding why Tarrega cut off his nails, which frankly I'm not that interested in. The crucial thing is that after studiously developing the technique over several months, he evidently came to prefer it, and encouraged his students to cut off their nails as well, most of whom followed their teacher. The notable exception was Miguel Lobet. I suspect that in part Tarrega and his students may have found in it something more suited to a silky, romantic, melodious sound. It also fulfilled, I suspect, an aesthetic ideal of purity and intimacy. So yet again, no nails playing became a potent force. Tarrega's best students, for example Emilio Pujol, Daniel Fortea, Josefina Robledo, championed no nails playing in the decades following Tarrega's death. And Emilio Pujol, most of all, taught many students the technique. But unfortunately, it wasn't to last. The overwhelmingly dominant guitarist of the time was not one of Tarrega's students, but rather André Segovia. Segovia, though he employed much of the Tarrega technique in terms of hand position and stylistic traits such as use of glissandi, he nevertheless played with nails, and produced a spectacular and varied sound this way. He pushed vigorously for a new repertoire, and to force the guitar onto concert halls, and thus on an equal platform with other instruments. He became the example to follow, and unfortunately, Segovia was not infrequently cruel to those who did not follow his example in all things guitar-related, including, notably, Emilio Pujol's student, Manuel Cubedo, whom he cruelly tried to humiliate in a 1956 masterclass because he disapproved of Cubedo's no-nails technique. Segovia also expressed in his autobiography a strong opposition to Tarrega's disciples, whom with few exceptions he regarded as cultish, narrow-minded, and musically unconvincing, and thus ruining the great Tarrega's legacy. That criticism, somewhat amusingly, that would later be levelled against Segovia and his influence. I am, I think, one of many who has mixed feelings about the legacy of Segovia. But regardless, his influence was overwhelming, and he won the battle for nails convincingly, though I do not believe either side won the argument, nor can the argument ever be won. This is not to say that the no-nail players of the Tarrega school lacked prominence or were uninfluential, though it became something of a lost cause. Many no-nail players followed a parallel course to Segovia, as well as continuing brilliantly the Tarrega legacy of transcriptions for the guitar and writing their own modest compositions for the instrument. They, like Segovia, were involved in the creation and editing of new works for the guitar by non-guitarist composers. For example, Eduardo Lopez Chavarri dedicated a work to Josefina Robledo, and Joaquin Nin-Camel dedicated a work to Emilio Pujol and his wife, which, in fact, I'm learning at this very moment. It's a very beautiful tribute. Emilio Pujol, in particular, has a number of works dedicated to him, and he edited even more, including those by Grau, Rodrigo, Halfter, Brockwell, Smith-Brindle, on top of his extensive work uncovering early music, particularly for the vihuela, an early guitar-like instrument which was Spain's alternative to the lute. In terms of performance, the no-nail students of Tarrega were great and convincing champions of the guitar. It's unfortunate that the surviving recordings of Pujol and Robledo are poor, mostly home recordings made at the end of their performing career. For Pujol in particular, we have many vihuela recordings from when he was quite elderly, ill, and deaf, unfortunately. They were only ever meant for private use and should be avoided. There are two earlier recordings of him playing duets with his wife, who was also a guitarist, which I've linked to below. Superb performances, but poor recording quality from old 78. When Pujol was younger, he was an extraordinary player by all accounts. In 1912, at age 26, he was the first ever guitarist to perform at one of the greatest concert halls, my favourite concert hall, the Wigmore Hall, then named the Bechstein Hall. His programme included virtuoso works like Grand Jota and the Bach Fugue in G minor. It was, by all accounts I can find, a very fine performance, and was the first of many guitar recitals that would be played, and continue to be played, at that great hall. Though notably the concert was interrupted by the eccentric former student of Tarrega, Dr. Walter Leckie, who, following the final notes of Tarrega's Capriccio Arabe, marched down the aisle of that hallowed and hushed hall, and shouted, "Viva Tarrega!" and then returned to his seat, to the shock of the phlegmatic British audience, as Pujol describes them. Pujol, over the course of his life, gravitated more and more towards the academy, pedagogy, and early music, where his influence is still felt today. Yet he wrote curiously little about the actual mechanics of playing without nails, often using more spiritual and aesthetic language, making it even harder for those of us trying to rediscover the technique today. I assume much of the practicalities of no-nails playing was passed down orally, from teacher to pupil. Indeed, Pujol had many students, and those seemingly content to let them play with or without nails, many chose to follow their teacher's example. Yet by the time of Pujol's death in 1980, at the age of 94, no-nails playing was almost extinct. So despite the impressive efforts of the Tarrega school, we again find that flesh playing is almost entirely out of favour, though there are a number of fine players who still use the technique. See the description below for some links. I hope it might once again be revived, and that the two techniques can coexist without one largely excluding the other. It would seem to me that the two quote-unquote factions struggle to coexist together. Usually one side thinks itself superior to the other, and seldom do you find a truly balanced view. Yet it also seems to me that, currently, we are heading towards what is, for good or ill, a more pluralistic musical culture, and it may be that the two sides will more comfortably coexist in the future. Indeed, on the internet there is a space developing for no-nail playing, most notably thanks to the monumental efforts of Rob McKillop and others who I link to below. My opinion on the nails versus no nails debate is in line with Pujol's, who simply but beautifully wrote, "What matters in art is the spirit. Let us be glad, then, that the guitar should offer this duality of aspects, which will allow each artist to realize his own work with sincerity, and gather, through it, the just reward of his merits."